People who have faith in the shroud as the burial cloth of Christ, but don't understand or don't know the science, when they get to know it and learn it, have more respect for the cloth because of that. Science truly followed and faith well followed blend to form the truth, and the truth is on that cloth.
One possibility, of course, is that we have some unknown man who was scourged, crucified, stabbed with a lance, crowned with thorns, who spent less than 3 days within his burial shroud and bears his image in such a way that it cannot be recreated with all the technology that exists today. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it may be Jesus the Christ.
This is your salvation. This is love in action.
The St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation, in partnership with Patchwork Heart Ministry and Fiat Ministry Network, presents a podcast for families in crisis.
Hello, and welcome to a podcast from the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith. This is Ann DeSantis, joined by Mickey Kelly, Board President of the Foundation. Mickey, welcome back again to our 10 Saints series.
Hi, and thank you for having me. I'm super excited about this episode of the Saints series.
I am too. And you know, it's funny. It's a great capstone to part 1 of our 10 Saints series, because this is episode 10 and it's on Saint Maximilian Kolbe. And he's a wonderful saint, especially on the topic of sacrifice. And he sacrificed his life so that another man was able to live during the time of Auschwitz and during the time of the Holocaust. And there's so much to unpack there. And so why don't we start out with, Mickey, maybe what is it that you like best about St. Maximilian Kolbe before we kind of dive into his bio?
Sure. So, and he actually has been one of the most remarkable Franciscans, especially considering how, even though he was doing missionary work for a while, he actually was pulled back to Poland. And at the time, of course, you had World War II that was happening. And he was fearless. And even though he was captured and he was sentenced to Auschwitz, he still managed to, carry on his duties as a priest. I think one story that many of us are familiar with was someone escaped from the camp, and they had the Gestapo lined up several people, and there was one father that was very scared, and St. Maximilian Kolbe stepped in to say, I'll take his place. And of course, sure enough, he did. And they went through this whole starvation chamber, and they were praying, they were singing songs of praise and worship and what have you. And St. Maximilian Kolbe actually was the lone survivor of that chamber. And they, lethally injected him, and that ultimately killed him. I think that's one thing I really enjoy about St. Maximilian Kolbe. The other thing I really enjoy about him is he has a writing called Let Yourself Be Led by the Immaculate. And he actually was founder of the militia of the Immaculata. And in Philadelphia, actually, they have they have an annual men's retreat at Malvern for the namesake of St. Maximilian Kolbe. And he wrote a series. He also wrote essays that were based around the Immaculata. It's a series that talked about basically enforcing church teachings, to talk about the Blessed Mother, and even the church teachings too, because he for quite a bit of time he also spoke against Freemasonry. And I honestly, I think this is I couldn't think of a better saint to talk about than St. Maximilian Kolbe, who I think we can learn a lot from, especially when it comes to families.
Yeah, well said. And there's so much online about him too, Mickey, and I'm sure that some of our listeners know that too. If you just Google search, Saint Maximilian Kolbe, there's all kinds of websites that offer a little bit about his bio. And you said it best. I mean, I think what strikes me the most, and most people when they hear the story, is that he sacrificed himself. He wasn't afraid when someone else was going to be executed. He stepped forward. I mean, if you can imagine what that was like, I mean, I know I can't imagine it, what it would have been like to do that. But because he loved God so much and he wanted to imitate Christ, and he had a real love of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And that was a big part of his spirituality, that he was always interceding to Mary and teaching others about Mary. And on this one website that I'm looking at, it's St. Maximilian Kolbe Church.com. There's actually a parish here. It says that he was a Polish conventual Franciscan friar, and during the occupation of Poland, he remained at the monastery, which published a number of anti-Nazi German publications. In 1941, he was arrested and sent to Auschwitz, where in terrible circumstances, he continued to work as a priest and offer solace to fellow inmates. When the Nazi guard selected 10 people to be starved to death in punishment, Kolbe volunteered to die in place of a stranger. He was later canonized as a martyr. And that man that he stepped in for was a person that had several children. I'm not sure exactly at the time. I think he at least had 6 children at home. And he said, I remember hearing that he had said, this man has a family and children, I will step in. And so what a beautiful thing that he gave his life, and the times that we can't even imagine what those times were like during the Second World War, and what was going through the minds of the people that were scared, so scared. And he through the Lord and through the Holy Spirit, he was able to gain that courage to do what he had to do. And he gave his life for that man. So I know that he was, or John Paul II recognized him and canonized him. Let's talk a little bit about that, Mickey, because I know that you probably have some information there.
Yes, and Saint John Paul the Great. I mean, Saint John Paul II. I mean, he was really big on trying to canonize many of the Polish. I mean, one of them would be Saint Faustina, who gave us the devotion to Divine Mercy. Saint Maximilian Kolbe. I don't think Saint John Paul II knew him directly, but he has heard of him, and I realized that like he had a connection. He was really really set on trying to get him canonized, because I mean, I think Poland needed some saints. In fact, there was a thing that I was reading. In fact, if we were watching World Youth Day that took place in Krakow, Poland, Pope Francis, while he was visiting, he actually visited the concentration camp where St. Maximilian Kolbe, died. And so the facts are that Kolbe was killed on August 14th after 16 days of being in the bunker with the fellow inmates, the eve of the Assumption. And it's no coincidence that St. Maximilian Kolbe, just like St. John Paul II, had a deep devotion to the Blessed Mother. And I honestly thought it really summed up his sufficient to be he had a heroic virtue. And at the time of the Knights Immaculata magazine, 800,000 people in Poland alone were subscribed to it. And if ultimately the Nazis saw him as a threat, especially with many of his correspondents, speaking out against the Nazis. And for St. John Paul II, as a native of Poland, he knew full well like what many of the Catholics in Poland went through under the Gestapo, because he too had to be on an underground seminary for the Archdiocese of Krakow during the fall of 1942. And at the time, like St. John Paul II was roughly a young lad, like in his early 20s. And he was actually impacted by the sacrifice and the witness of Father Maximilian Kolbe. And he was actually St. John Paul II was ordained a priest on All Saints' Day, 1946. And he was the only person to be ordained a priest that year, believe it or not. And he actually would mirror St. Maximilian Kolbe by getting 2 doctoral degrees after leaving Poland. In 1963, he was named Archbishop through Saint Paul VI. And I think it's kind of coincidental too that at the time that St. John Paul II was made Archbishop, he was in the city where St. Faustina died right before Germany invaded Poland, and also where St. Maximilian Kolbe was living, under the terror of the Nazis. I think what also too, St. John Paul II make a pilgrimage to the concentration camp, and he knelt in block 11, cell 18, the very spot where St. Maximilian Kolbe died, kissed the floor, and prayed in agony. And he also embraced the father who would have been killed if it weren't for St. Maximilian Kolbe. And he attended St. Maximilian Kolbe's canonization, which was held in 1982.
Wow, thank you. That's a wealth of information. I mean, I would recommend to anybody listening to this podcast that, don't let it end at this podcast. Definitely read and learn more about St. Maximilian Kolbe. And as Mickey said, that he was beatified by, he was beatified by Pope Paul VI. And it says here online that, and in 1971, I guess that was when that initial beatification, and then canonized in 1982 by John Paul II, which is wonderful because obviously he's a beautiful saint of our time. And Sergeant Francis Gaginistic was the man whose life was saved by the martyrdom of Father Maximilian Kolbe. That's very interesting. He is the man who obviously his life was saved and spared, and he was able to go. So that's an amazing thing. And from what I understand, his family was there too, in St. Peter's Square when that happened. I also pulled up, Mickey, maybe for discussion, is some quotes of St. Maximilian Kolbe. And one quote that I pulled up he says that Mary's will does not differ from the will of God. Calling upon her without reserve, you manifest a love for the will of God. And her will is so perfect that in nothing does it differ from his. Thus you give glory to God that he created so perfect a creature and took her for his mother. So, we're in the month of May, and this podcast is being premiered in May of 2023, and May is the month of Mary. So let's just talk about that because, obviously St. Maximilian Kolbe knew and understood the important role of our Blessed Mother in our interceding to the Lord. And I want to make that shout out to our listeners who are those who are in crisis, because this is the Families in Crisis podcast. And St. Maximilian Kolbe is also the saint of those who are addicted. He's the patron saint. So let's talk a little bit about that, because isn't it amazing that the intercession of Mary was such an important role in the life of St. Maximilian Kolbe?
It's interesting you mentioned that too, Anne, because there was a story about St. Maximilian Kolbe when he was being one of those rambunctious, rebellious children. the Blessed Mother appeared to him, and he was given a choice between a red crown and a white crown. And I think it also goes to show you that he had a choice that he wound up being a martyr of charity, because especially this lifeless, the selfless sacrifice he made for the other person. But if there's one thing I could also add too, like that St. Maximilian Kolbe, ever since that apparition from the Blessed Mother, he had a deep devotion to him. One of his famous quotes too would be, "You can never love the Blessed Mother so much. And you know what? I mean, it's very fitting too. Like, this podcast coming out in the month of May. It's the Marian month, dedicated to the Blessed Mother. You have Mother's Day, but every day is Mother's Day when you pray the Rosary. And I think if there's one thing, like there's like another quote that I saw from St. Maximilian Kolbe. Our dependence on Mary is greater than what we can imagine. We receive all graces, absolutely all of them, from God through the Immaculate, who is our universal mediatrix with Jesus."
That's beautiful. Yeah, it's we can't have this podcast about St. Maximilian Kolbe without talking about the Blessed Mother, honestly. I mean, because she was his, I should say, primary saint that he interceded to. And I did find something else online that I thought was interesting to bring up, another quote. He says that modern times are dominated by Satan and will be more so in the future. The conflict with hell cannot be engaged by men, even the most clever. The Immaculata alone has from God the promise of victory over Satan. However, assumed into heaven, the Mother of God now requires our cooperation. She seeks souls who will consecrate themselves entirely to her, who will become in the hands effective instruments for the defeat of Satan and the spreading of God's kingdom upon earth. I think it's interesting that he starts out by saying that modern times are dominated by Satan and more so in the future. It's almost like he had an idea of what was going to be coming. That was happening obviously in the early 1940s when he probably made that statement or wrote that statement, and how true it is that we've seen such adversities in our world. It continues to happen, but just like Our Lady of Fatima, which honestly, we're taping this right before the feast of Our Lady of Fatima, which is on May 13th. Isn't it just a wonderful thing and a beautiful thing to be guided by St. Maximilian Kolbe to the Blessed Mother? Talk about that, Mickey. I know you have a devotion also to Our Lady of Fatima.
It is actually Our Lady of Guadalupe, but that's okay. I think there's nothing wrong with having a devotion to the Blessed Mother, especially if there's one of the Marian titles that are attracted to you. And given my work, building a culture of life, it's been Our Lady of Guadalupe. And she's the patroness of the unborn. She's the patroness of expectant mothers and what have you. And I just thought, you know what? Here we go. That's what I need. But it's a very interesting quote too by St. Maximilian Kolbe, that you look at what's been happening in our culture today, especially with the recent events like the shootings and the hyper promotion, or this hyping up the whole transgender, or the gay rights, lesbians, whatever the case is. It's not the people that are doing it. It's because they're being influenced by Satan. Even St. Maximilian Kolbe, that knew that not everybody, it's Satan that influenced the Gestapo trying to destroy Catholicism in Poland. But then they realized they awakened a sleeping giant, not by guns, bullets, tanks, planes, whatever, is because of their strong faith. And of course, the Russians underestimated that later when they took over Poland, through the Iron Curtain. And the one thing that in order for Satan to lose is that there are faithful souls out there that will consecrate themselves to her. And in her hands, we will become her instruments that will defeat her and, bring God's kingdom upon the earth, as you mentioned the quote, Anne. I think if there's one thing we learned from St. Maximilian Kolbe with his deep devotion to the Blessed Mother, we too can be the instrument. Even St. Teresa of Calcutta, who is focused on one of our previous episodes, or we talked about her from time to time. To paraphrase what she said, we're just the pencil in God's hands. And let's face it, we're telling, not only is God telling our story, but we're telling his story too. And there's nothing we can do about it, and there's no turning back.
Yeah, we're all part of salvation history in some way, shape, or form. I appreciate your words of wisdom there. I do want to make sure that it is a corrected thing on the dates, though. The Feast of Our Lady of Fatima is May 13th. So I just want to make sure I just double checked on that. It's my husband's birthday too. A Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe is December 12th, but Feast of Fatima is May 13th. So just for people to be sure to celebrate that. Now, of course, this podcast is airing the end of May, but I did find another quote that I wanted to share on Maximilian Kolbe, and it says that to be Catholic, when you kneel before an altar, do it in such a way that others may be able to recognize that who you are kneeling before. So I'm going to read it again, make sure that it makes sense. To be Catholic, when you kneel before an altar, do it in such a way that others may be able to recognize that you know before whom you kneel. So, in other words, what he's saying is it's so important for us to be reverent, isn't it? Reverent before the Blessed Sacrament, reverent when we receive the sacraments, and reverent when we attend Mass. So I think that's an important lesson that we are learning from St. Maximilian Kolbe. Obviously, he was a person of great devotion. He was a person of great respect for the faith. Otherwise, he never would have given his life for another human being, right? Because he wanted to do God's will. That meant more to him than just living himself. So let's talk about that, Mickey. I know that devoting yourself, that's an important thing for you and for me. But as he said, who are we kneeling before? It's remembering and recognizing the Blessed Sacrament, isn't it? Jesus in the Holy Eucharist. Let's talk about that.
I feel like with Catholics, especially those that are very devout and brought up in the faith, we say that Catholics in name only, Protestants, even atheists, would would acknowledge it, or even it also maybe open the door to potential, mockeries and all that. So, yeah, even St. Maximilian Kolbe knew that we must be Catholic. It's actually echoed in today's society, when we're asked to do the extraordinary, even though it can be ordinary. We're called to stand out. That should be our life goal. We are in with others. We're becoming part of the world. When we step away, we're standing out for something that is bigger than ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. Our faith, if we want to be healed in this world, and we're talking to families in crisis on this podcast, right? They're listening to this podcast right now. Healing means that we believe, trust, and follow the Lord And that's where healing really happens, is when we make that decision in our lives, the decision that we do want to be part of the family, right? The family of God, the family of our beautiful, wonderful Catholic faith. And we know that St. Maximilian Kolbe knew that very, very well. And one of the most famous famous lines of him, he says, is that without sacrifice, there is no love. And that was one of his words of wisdom. And isn't that the truth? And I think that for our listeners and people who are going through some kind of adversity, especially those who might have relatives, friends, or maybe they themselves are addicted in some way, because he is the patron saint of addictions. And I know that as executive director for this foundation, that's a very major part of what we hear in terms of people who reach out to us who need help. It's either their husband, their wife, their son, their daughter, can even be something like their, other people in their lives. So there's just so much more for us to unpack. Mickey, did you have any final words before we end on this podcast about Maximilian Kolbe?
I think one quote that really stands out to me, I think it's very appropriate, especially what we're seeing, is no one in the world can change truth. What can we do and should do is to seek truth and to serve it when we have found it. The real conflict is the inner conflict. And I think another one that really stands out to me is, let us give ourselves to the Immaculata Mary. Let her prepare us. Let her receive him, Jesus, in Holy Communion. And let's face it, I honestly think we have a perfect Marian saint for this, to wind down this inaugural season of the saints.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing that I have to give you credit, Mickey. You were the one that made the decision on doing this podcast on Maximilian Kolbe, Saint Maximilian Kolbe. And I think it was a wonderful way to end this part one of our series, our 10 Saint series. I really have to say, I think this has been a wonderful series. And I'm asking all of you who are listening, if you haven't been able to listen to the other podcasts, please do go to our Philly Nonnatus YouTube channel, because we have a whole 10 parts to this. And great news, we're going to be doing part 2. So we have a whole other set of 10, and we're looking forward to that. So Mickey, thank you so much for joining us on this whole series of 10 saints for the St. Raymond Nonnatus
Thank you for having
Foundation.
me, Anne.
So God bless all of you, and we will see you here next month for our 10 Saints series, part 2, the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith. See you then.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more information about the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation, visit nonnatus.org or email director.srnf@gmail.com.
People who have faith in the shroud as the burial cloth of Christ, but don't understand or don't know the science, when they get to know it and learn it, have more respect for the cloth because of that. Science truly followed and faith well followed blend to form the truth, and the truth is on that cloth.
One possibility, of course, is that we have some unknown man who was scourged, crucified, stabbed with a lance, crowned with thorns, who spent less than 3 days within his burial shroud and bears his image in such a way that it cannot be recreated with all the technology that exists today. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it may be Jesus the Christ.
This is your salvation. This is love in action.